So welcome everybody, and thanks so much for coming to this fourth session of the Qualifie this academic term on mapping and sampling the field. And yeah, we're super happy to have Greta Semplici, Greta Semplici here with us today. To kind of give us an introduction on sampling, on methods of sampling, on strategies of sampling, both from her own experience, and she then will today also do a workshop with us where we can think through sampling strategies, different sampling strategies practically, based on four pieces of research or Ph.D. research we've been sent, which is by Ophelia, Annette, Mariusz, and myself, and we're going to use those pieces of research question to kind of think through sampling practically. Greta is a Max Weber Fellow here at the EOI. She has previously done a PhD at the Department for International Development in Oxford, and has worked with pastoralist populations in Kenya, and has done extensive field work there. And I think that puts her in a fascinating position to talk with us today about sampling. And I'm really curious to see and hear her insights on that today. So the session will be structured in two parts. The first part will, the first hour roughly, will feature a talk by Greta, where she talks about her own experiences about sampling in her field research. And we can then open up the floor for just a general discussion and Q&A where everybody can introduce their own questions and comments, and we can discuss those. And the second hour, we want to think through it practically, as we said before, and do this workshop together, where we will split the group into breakout rooms and discuss several scenarios in smaller groups, but Greta will also maybe give us more information on that. That being said, without further ado, Greta, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm putting a timer just to check that we stay in time. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for being here to attend this hopefully useful workshop that we try to organize. As already said, I was asked to share a little bit of my experience first, because it seems useful to know for you to hear real hand struggles in doing qualitative research. But then, since I'm not necessarily an expert on sampling strategies for qualitative research, I thought to organize this workshop activity for you to really try it out and see implications, impacts on the data you collect by choosing one strategy rather than another one, how this is linked very much with the objective and research questions of your project. And we were, given 4 wonderful scenarios to play with, which hopefully makes it even useful for the people who shared it. But we'll move to this later on. First myself. I'm gonna go through a bit of my experience for about 20 minutes, and then we open the floor for another 20 minutes for questions, and then start this exercise. My name is Greta Semplici, as already introduced. I was actually trained in development economics here at the University of Florence. I'm originally from Florence. And I worked during my master and a little bit after that for an international organization as a monitoring and evaluation consultant for a building resilience kind of program. And even though we can trace my interest on resilience or other big concepts inflated in the development sector, even how they're used, what they mean, this sort of things from even before then. It was about then when I developed the idea to pursue a PhD with the scope to understand the use of this new, at the time, trendy word, which was resilience. And during the messiness of my first year of the PhD, the project ended up being about the use of resilience in dry lands, and specifically how it is applied in programs intended to support pastoralist populations, who are the main inhabitants of rangelands and dry lands, because the most efficient and productive livelihood source in those contexts, though governments and development agencies are still denying that and misusing rangelands for other purposes, trying to transform pastoralists in something else, and so forth. But anyway, as I started my PhD with a very broad idea of studying resilience, but not much more than that, it then started this painful process of narrowing down, which already entails some sampling related reflections or decisions, such as the case study selection. And myself, I decided to go in Kenya. I see if I can share my screen to show you exactly. Yeah. I decided to go in Kenya because at the time was the country with the largest number of resilience labeled programs in the world, and therefore was easy for me to justify the selection of the case study. So a sort of what I think can be framed an intensity sampling. So an information-rich case that manifests the phenomenon intensively. But then also a bit of a convenient sampling, because I had lived in Kenya before and I felt more comfortable in planning my research ahead, thinking to be going there, even though then I end up in a part of Kenya that I had never been before, and it was all very new to me. Once I selected the country, that of course wasn't enough as a case study, so the second question was where in Kenya? And again, I think I decided for the most salient case I could find in Kenya. So perhaps again of a sort of an intensity sampling, which was in Turkana County, the yellowish highlighted area. For different reasons. One, because in the Horn of Africa, resilience programs are strongly tied with drought emergencies, which are characteristics of dry lands and arid counties, of which Turkana County is one of the 23 in Kenya. And also at the time, the county receiving the largest number of resilience labeled aid. And also, perhaps because it was sort of the most difficult, let me say that way, county, though I will never say it ever again beside this workshop, because it's totally against all my arguments so far. But it is in a way a harsh landscape. It's very remote, it's poor, it's subject to frequent shocks and disasters. It has an important history of colonial resistance, independence, autonomy. So a sort of perfect case study for a resilience study, or at least the most literal take on resilience possible. And also a bit of convenience again, because I met an anthropologist who was working in the area, who had worked in the past for a very long time in the area, and therefore would be a person I could exchange information with, who otherwise I wouldn't have had, because no one around me was working in the region. So now we selected the topic, narrow it down. We selected the case study, narrow it down. But then who do you talk to anyway? And this largely depends on the approach, as well on the objectives, as I mentioned at the beginning. So this will vary from case to case, but I try to reconstruct a little bit my experience. When I set off to fieldwork, my research question was as broad as, actually stop sharing for a little bit. My research question was as broad as, what does resilience mean for beneficiaries? I'm sorry. Because I felt that in the resilience scholarship, that was the gap. There was more attention on the theoretical side, on the development institution side, but not much on what's the voice of the beneficiaries. But then pretty soon, the question, I make it even larger if possible, because once in the field, I realized that it wasn't necessarily easy to identify resilience program. So beyond the websites of the donors or the large schemes, once I was there, officers weren't necessarily talking the language, programs weren't necessarily really implemented. Also, the category beneficiary wasn't that well specified or existent, ready to be interviewed and met. And then I also found it constraining a little bit to think, to understand resilience through people who receive resilience programs. So somehow I imagine they would be influenced by the program language if I would be able to identify them and the way. So I end up making a further rupture from the development sector. So working from them, then studying how they would use resilience and studying how beneficiary understand the use of resilience program that they receive. And now I move to trying to understand what resilience could possibly mean for Turkana herders or people who inhabit a dry land environment more generally, regardless being beneficiaries or not, even because everyone in Turkana at some point has been a beneficiary of something. So that wasn't necessarily the main point. So my study had a strong turn towards ethnographic, experiential, almost phenomenological approaches. Until then, I was hoping to do a mixed method study. So at some point, I would imagine taking my survey out and do a measurement of resilience to take my economist back. But that didn't happen. I spent 8 months of consecutive field work, letting all these pre-assumptions kind of go, deciding to follow the everyday life of the people I would encounter as much as possible. Also, since the place was new to me, and there was another factor why this anthropological turn was important, because I was really little familiar with the place. I had no experience of pastoralism, dry lands, the environment, the society. So I did need such a deep immersion. But because of this reason, and now I think I share again, sorry. Because of these reasons of little familiarity with the context, I adopted a mix of maximum variation and convenience sampling. Convenience meaning that I went to places that I felt were safe enough. So the north part and the south part of the county were and still are very unsettled. So alone as I was, I didn't think it was a smart choice to go there. So I concentrated on this central, highlighted in red zone of the county. And within these, then I adopted a geographic gradient sampling approach, crossing through different livelihood zones and socio-ecologies, and identified 3 field sites, the blue ones, so to capture, so to obtain the greatest variation in the life ways possible. And in each field site, I spent first some time in the main village, the blue dot, hosted by the chief, and working with the research assistant I hired directly from the community to show me around. And this was important to, let people familiarize with my presence, spreading the rumor of my presence, building rapport, which I think will be your next workshop. And during this time, I asked this local research assistant to help me interview people who would be representative of different social stratus, or wealth or social status categories. So we built up a sort of stratified, purposive sampling, of course, with the bias of the person who was taking me around, but without him, I wouldn't even be able to reach those people anyway. And then we added a bit of snowballing, so asking the people we interviewed who we should be talking to next. At the time, I was doing a mixed method approach in my mind. So this was an exploratory phase for which I had prepared semi-structured interviews to get a sense of life in a desertscape centered around risks and shocks and disasters, which are central to resilience theory. And I also adopted a key informant sampling, talking with elders or representative of associations such as wealth associations, youth associations, microcredit associations, to have the best information possible about very specific aspects of everyday life in the context. But I progressively felt some limitations from this approach as well. I felt I wasn't really getting a sense, I wasn't really understanding how life was for my host. There was a bit of separation, and hence decided to move to live with a family. And I followed this pattern more or less in every field site. And I chose the family adopting a sort of criterion sampling, so those families who would be responding to certain criteria, such as those who had already who I had already met and I got along with, or those who were relatively better off so that my presence wouldn't be an excessive burden, those with whom elders or chiefs would agree I would stay so not to clash with their position in the community and so forth. So certain factors played in the decisions of what families I would move to live with. In some cases it went very well, in other cases a bit less so, but in general I think I built most of my arguments from my thesis from these closer experiences, and retrospectively sometimes I wish I spent longer with the families. So kind of maybe having fewer field sites so that I could have more time for the family in the remaining ones, even though at the same time, in other parts of my arguments are built from this larger scale perspective. So in terms of connections and mobilities, which is missing in development programs which operate much more locally, missing out dynamics in and out the areas of intervention. So there is a bit of trade-off there, I think. And then I had a break. 8 months had passed. I went twice or more in each field site, first spending time in the main village, then moving to live with one family, and then I went back home. This time was initially planned so that I would have time to develop the surveys to be run in the second round of fieldwork that I already knew that wouldn't happen, but I nonetheless needed some time to rest. I needed a break. I don't know if you already had a chance in your workshop sessions to talk about, you know, the fact that fieldwork can be exhaustive and can be emotionally draining and super lonely. And I was also full of insecurities. I didn't really know if I was moving in the right directions and so forth. So time was needed. And I took 5 months off, which I think was the best choice I made during my PhD. Because like it's something I really recommend, a break in between fieldwork, because it gives you time to rest, but also gives you, most importantly, it gives you time to rethink about your entire experience a bit more detached. It gives you time to organize your material, to read through your notes, to let some themes emerge, understanding what gaps you have in your data set, doing some readings, etc. So it's really important time. And in that time, I reformulated my research questions a little bit more concretely, though they're still yet far to be well developed, I think. But I had come to a theorization of resilience in the development sector as being tied with the field of disaster planning around 3 main issues of interest, because considered particularly threatened by shocks and disasters. And these are the environment, livelihoods, and bodies, so the safety of the people. And in dry lands, this is often linked to food insecurity, though not only. And since this area of interest, these topics were also rising as important theme from my notes of my own fieldwork, which was detached from the development programs at the time, then I thought, I decided to actually examine the local meanings of those dimensions and contrast them with the interpretations emerging from policy documents, development interventions, and scholarships. So the research questions ended up being what do we learn about those components of pastoral developments currently discussed under a resilience agenda by switching perspective and following the pastoralist everyday experience? And how does this new understanding of resilience emerging from this shift relate to the contemporary ideas of resilience in policy, practice, and scholarship? So then, when I felt ready, I had reconceptualized a bit my research. I saw some emerging themes. I had a clear idea of the questions I was trying to answer. I went back to the fieldwork, and I had a second round of extensive fieldwork. I went back to the same families I stayed before, but also having gained a bit of independence to move around, I started moving. So in the blue areas, I moved. I didn't stay in one place, but I moved a lot alone together with my research assistant, adopting a sort of more opportunistic approach to sampling, kind of following what was happening with a bit of serendipity of things that were happening and a bit of snowballing. So from one situation to another situation and being ready to follow it, remaining all the time attentive to the elements of everyday life which would speak to me about those elements, those themes that I became interested of. So environment, livelihoods, and food. So from this round of research, but actually pretty much my own experience, I think that my research experience or fieldwork can be defined as a nomadic, as having employed a nomadic approach to research, which makes total sense in the context of nomadism that I was surrounded by. But what I mean is that not only I became progressively mobile myself, but also the research approaches I adopted kept on evolving and changing, including sampling methods during the whole research in order to opportunistically get the best out of evolving situation as a nomad would do. So now this very long story to show you basically that A, things can change and evolve, and as long as you do it with criterion, that is okay. B, that you can have multiple sampling approaches at the same time, sort of overlapping, and that the sampling approaches that you decide to employ can change through time. You don't necessarily have to stick to that, but it can evolve itself. So maybe we stop here before we start this other introduction, or no, actually, maybe I'll talk you through this as well, so that we have all the elements for a broader discussion than my own simple experience, which is interesting, but not necessarily for everyone. Here, I just have a couple of slides more to broaden up, as I was saying, from my experience to sampling or data collection. From seeing your program through the Qualifie activities and seminars, I had the impression that with this workshop, we are entering you know, the actual contentious issues of data collection. So after an ethic workshop, a positionality, a decolonization of fieldwork workshop, you're now putting your hands on the practicality of how to actually collect data. And I have taken this image from Cresswell and Pop to show that data collection is a composite set of interrelated activities aimed at gathering good information to answer the research question you want to answer. And you can start at any point of the circle. The important thing is that you must consider all of them. So data collection means more than the typical reference point of do interviews or making observations. And by placing ethics in the middle of the circles, it means that every single of these phases must be considered, reflected ethically or with reference to ethics. So sampling is one of these activities. And because the qualitative research aims at achieve depth of understanding, while quantitative research aims at achieving breadth of understanding, then the sampling will not be a probabilistic or probability sampling. So it will not enable you to determine statistical inference to a population, but rather it is a purposeful sample that will intentionally sample a group of people that can best inform the researcher about a research problem or questions under investigation. So individuals are selected because they can purposefully, I cannot say this word, inform an understanding of a certain phenomenon, which means identifying individuals who are knowledgeable or have experienced the phenomenon under research, but also individuals who are able and willing to give the information you are searching for, to capable of communicating and expressing opinions and ideas and sharing their stories. Purposive sampling is generally used to include participants from the broadest possible, including the broadest possible perspectives, though that's not only the case, because you may also want to include people who respond to a certain criterion, so be it a very homogeneous sampling, to go very much in depth into the topic you are researching. So decisions need to be taken about what and should, who and what should be sampled, what forms the sampling can take, and also how many, the sample size, how many people or sites you want to sample. And so it's not always clear to know what forms your sampling will. I have a few examples here. It's not always clear to know what forms the sampling will take, and very much it will depend on the objectives of your methodology and the potential impact of selecting one strategy rather than another one. But largely the strategies would share the fact that some of them, such as the one in this slide, so the maximum variation, so no, these are these one, the maximum variations, the stratified purposeful sampling or the purposeful random sampling, those are strategies which are used to identify and expand the range of variations on, and put emphasis on differences to have as many perspectives as possible in your sampling. While these one in the first slides were kind of built in order to have, in order to narrow the range of variations, so to have homogeneity and similarity in your sample group. And then there is one final point I make, which is about sample size, that generally in qualitative research is built around the concept of saturation. So you will continue sampling your population until you are not getting any new information or insights. As a general guidelines, so the general guideline is not only to study a few sites or individuals, but also to collect extensive details about each of these case studies or individuals. So decisions need to be made about two things: the number of units to be sampled, but also the levels of details you want per each of the sampled units. And then you'll find out that with careful sampling, as well as careful data collection, of course, surprisingly a small number of, surprising at least for me when I came from economics, a small number of interviews or narratives or focus groups or whatever is your approach, a small number can yield a sufficient number of data to answer your research question. And I think that's all. Then we share a link in which you can have access to these tables here, which maybe are useful. But for now, I stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Greta. Thanks a lot for sharing these great insights, both from your own experience and the larger picture and sampling. I would just open the floor. So if anybody has questions at this point for Greta, yeah, both on sampling more general or just on her own research, yeah, just raise the hand. Yeah, Caitlin, please.
Thanks, Wolfgang. Greta, thanks so much. It's always such a joy to hear about your work and to be at this point now of thinking back on everything. I was really interested by the way you frame the idea of convenient sampling. There's also bringing safety into that, because I feel like so often in qualitative research, ethics and, well, but safety specifically, kind of safety and risk gets seen as something quite separate. Like, is the field site safe? What are the kinds of risk mitigation strategies to take, et cetera, et cetera. And it was just a comment that I really liked the way you wove that into the convenience sampling idea and just having more of a realistic approach to doing your data collection. Just a comment.
Yeah, I agree. It's not like now that I was reading through some of the handbooks to understand what all this sampling thing is about, convenience is not framed in these terms at all. Yeah. But when I was thinking of my own experience, the reason why I went to those areas was mainly for that reason. So that I found it that it was the right way to frame it.
Marius, you also had a point?
Sure, thanks, Wolfgang. I have actually a few questions, but I mean, maybe I will just start with two now. First of all, I mean, Greta, thank you so much for this great presentation. I've really enjoyed it, and sounds like a really amazing project. So I'm a bit jealous of that. But to the questions, I thought I would start with two. First of all, I want to ask kind of pragmatically what, and I know maybe your project is a bit different, and it was different. I mean, every project is different, but basically, what can we do now? What can we do in terms of sampling before entering the field? Like, I don't know, did you contact any organizations? Did you contact any particular people? Do you know what I mean? Whether we can start actually sampling already, you know, now during the first year at EUI or whatever, you know, from Italy. And then the second question, I wonder if you can comment on or give some insights on how to identify key informants and how, you know, how people become key informants. And did you have any strategy? Did you have any criteria to do that? Or yeah, just your thoughts on that. Thank you.
No. How do I go? I just respond to the questions as they come through.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, if anyone has from their experience also insights to answer these questions, they're of course welcome. About what we can do now, I think both of the questions, the answer is really dependent on what's your research all about and if you can actually reach them, and what objectives you like, what you want to know from them. My research ended up being so broad as how is life there was really difficult to do sampling before I could go. So in both cases, something that I would have done retrospective that I haven't done, so maybe that's useful for you. When I was still thinking to do more of a looking at development programs and beneficiaries, I didn't map them out before. I mean, not at least, I mapped them down at a very high level in Kenya and the Horn of Africa. I didn't really map them out at the very local level, perhaps because there is not so much information, I don't know, but maybe I just didn't do it. And maybe that would have helped, or at least I would have already known from the beginning what was the situation there in terms of what programs are implemented, what not, etc. But then if your question is more like how to establish the actual connection with the people you want to do interviews, it depends on their subject. Like if they are people you can reach digitally, or from one level, like starting maybe at a, you can, I don't know whether starting from a university, like establishing links with universities there, and then seeing if there are researchers or students doing similar stuff, and then move, like starting from a bit higher before I imagine, going to the very specific individual. But it depends who your individual are. And about key informant interview, I think that's very important to have in a general, in the general scheme, to have some key informants to help you navigate some of the depth of some of the issues. It's okay if they are not all predetermined, so that you can also define them as you go. So depending again on what's your field, you may have an idea of an initial, like you can have already some ideas of who are important people to talk with, to open the field at least. But then as you go through, maybe certain themes will arise, such as in my case, all the issues about wells and boreholes. I suspect it was important, but I didn't really realize how important it was, and I didn't even know there were associations completely autonomous, self-managed, like not government or development at all, that were put up by the communities. So then I realized, well, I need to talk with some of the representatives of these associations to understand how they work. So there is my advice in this sense would be to remain as flexible as possible as you go through.
Lillian, you had a follow-up on that?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of kind of a similar question in terms of, you know, how much you thought about these sampling strategies, these case selection strategies before doing the research versus kind of reading about them and then thinking, okay, this does apply. Because I'm asking because for me, I think it was really hard to plan a lot in advance of my fieldwork because kind of following up on Marius's question, you didn't really know who was going to meet with you and how things would evolve and how the research would evolve. So even though I was really like reading methods books, even in the field, because I was trying to make sure I didn't do anything wrong, it was really difficult to do a lot in advance. And I found that I was reflecting a lot more on these strategies that Greta presented, or these different ways of framing your methods after I had done it. And so I don't know that that's a good practice or not, but I just thought it would be interesting to open the conversation a little bit to see if that was then other people's experiences, like for Greta or for Caitlin or for others. But I do think that being flexible is really good advice, and maybe knowing that when you get to the field, you know at least 2 or 3 people who can help be a gateway into furthering the research. And maybe they're at a higher level, like it's a university contact, or maybe a journalist. I found journalists to be very helpful. And then, you know, different journalists focus on different areas, so it can kind of cross across different areas of focus. But then those are the people that help get you to often who's the key informant, right? Because these people at the more general level don't always have the insights that you're really needing to get from the interviews. But so the question mark on this comment is just to Greta and to others about how much of these ideas you had formed about the methods beforehand versus during versus after.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't really framed that. Surely I didn't frame that in this way beforehand. One thing that I started thinking as I was preparing for this seminar, perhaps putting a little bit more thought than what I've done maybe on the implication of what deciding to go towards certain respondents rather than others would have on the data I obtained. So that's the part of this thinking about sampling, which I think is important to do beforehand. The actual sampling strategies, yeah, like it's important that you can, like, having an initial idea, having initial context to access the field and to let you go, but then being open to adjust all the time.
Any other questions? Marius, yes, please.
Sorry, this is a counter follow up because I mean, what you've been saying, like being flexible, and the idea of serendipity, and things like being opportunistic, open-minded, serendipity, snowball. I mean, in qualitative research, and in particular, like, I mean, I think ethnography and anthropology, that's, we all know those terms, and we all know what they mean and how to like operationalize them practically and stuff. But I'm just thinking again from practical point of view, how do I convince people from not this discipline that this is, a correct way of doing things? Like, that I will, in my perspectives, for example, or when I'm describing my research to people from other epistemological, positions, how do I describe to them and convince them, look, listen, I'm going to do snowball something, and I'm going to be open-minded, and I'm going to aim for serendipity. I mean, that's a bit of a problem there, no?
I think it depends. You justify through your, like, what you're aiming to achieve, what's your goal, what your research question. Like, the moment you don't want to generalize necessarily, like your objective is not to make a claim for the whole population, but to understand something, then this sampling is justified by default almost. It depends how you, what objectives you're aiming at. But maybe Kate and Lilian also, who are way more into qualitative research than I am.
Rubbish. No, I think it's exactly that. It's like, it's the framing, isn't it? And it's how you explain what your objectives of studying these questions are. And then also the practicality. We've talked previously about how some research topics, where there's very little available studies to base this work on, or where the people are very hard to get in contact with, or you simply have to, not only do you have to be there wherever there is, but you also have to really build trust and build rapport before you can even start to know what the right things to ask are, because people simply wouldn't talk to you. You could go to a place or be writing or thinking about a context and only base it on sort of policy reports available or whatever, but that would precisely miss the point of the kinds of questions you're trying to answer. So it's really, it has to be an inductive process in that way, otherwise you couldn't get to this kind of information. It's a block, basically. Lily, do you want to add maybe?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think through my experiences and what my advice would be. I think if you're submitting a prospectus in like a political science oriented field, then what I would recommend doing is, looking at these different ways of characterizing your field work. So, you're going to do snowball sampling, you're going to do convenience sampling, whatever it is, and like make a plan for that's what you're intending to do. And you're intending to do that because you need a certain type of data. And maybe that data and that data likely is something that you couldn't get easily at scale or through a random data generation process, because it's sensitive. It's not something that's publicly available, that for whatever reason, right? So you're doing this to get a certain type of data that you need to answer your question. And I just wouldn't, I think as long as you're not claiming that you're randomly sampling and therefore can confidently speak for the broader population, then you shouldn't run up against too much resistance. But I do see what you're saying, where we're like, be flexible, it'll probably change. You might not even know how to describe this until after. With that said, I think part of the process though is that you do try in the beginning to say like, this is what I'm doing, but maybe don't stress out too much about that, because it might change and shift. Like I just took screenshots of Greta's slides because I was like, oh, I should use that language in my next article.
So
like that's good. Like I hadn't thought to use that term before. So it's something that's constantly kind of evolving, but you can still kind of try to put terms on it as you go along to show that you are thinking about this rigorously. So I think we don't want to take away that this is a rigorous process. It's just that because it can shift and the nature of it kind of forces you to kind of change how you're doing things along the way. But I mean, I bet you could think about ways that applies to quantitative research as well. You know, you're missing data on this block of years, so now you have to think about whether you're going to impute data to fill it in, or whether you're going to look for another indicator, and then you look for the other indicator and actually the results don't pan out, so now you ask a different research question. So I don't think it's something that's only happening in qualitative work, but yeah, but just being honest and thoughtful, I think, would be my advice along the way.
Julian, please.
Yes, I have a question that has been bugging me for the last few days since I'm, first year writing the prospectus, and also very interesting because I'm also trying to do something mixed methods, and I'm starting to think that I might run into some similar issues to the ones you described. But in any case, so the question that I have is, if on the one hand, the type of data I want to generate is qualitative in nature and in-depth in nature and somewhat interpretive in nature, like it's about the meanings that people assign to things and practices. But on the other hand, the kind of people that I'm interested in is just really the average citizen of a given country. How do I do that? Like, what's my sampling strategy if I'm interested in the famous average citizen that doesn't exist, as everyone knows? Like it's a mirage, the average citizen. So yeah, I just wanted to ask what your insights are on this.
Open, eh? Avid citizen.
I mean, basically, okay, perhaps to give it a bit of or to embed the question. I mean, I'm trying to somewhat test the hypothesis, right? And so I thought that one way of sampling my respondents, or at least sampling my cases from where to gather respondents, would be to collect the alternative hypotheses from the literature and sample my cases or sub cases in function of where I think these alternative hypotheses would, if they are present, they would be there, right? Like if there's evidence for these alternative hypotheses, they would be there. So it's kind of a most likely, kind of crucial case study, kind of or crucial sub case selection. But even if I do that, right, like I can only go with some geographic indicators. I can go with economic indicators. I can go with historical indicators. But then if I'm interested in the, in not key informants or people who are recipients of some kind of program, but really just people, what do I do? Like, is it enough to say I'm doing convenience sample? Like I'm going there, I'm going to see whoever wants to talk to me, and this is the person I'm going to talk to, or what's the action plan here?
But sorry, in these alternative hypotheses, you want to they are opposite to your hypothesis?
They're not really opposite, but they're explanations from the literature, which I think don't work. Yeah, and actually, like the thing is, so I'm working on clientelism, right? Like that's and the researcher's question more or less why people don't outvote clientelist politicians. And the three big hypotheses in the field have to do with economic indicators, have to do with enforcement of clientelist ties, and have to do with bureaucratic or like more or less regalian reach of the state. So this kind of gives me three locations where I would expect, if these other alternative hypotheses work, this gives me three types of locations where I should look to see if they are actually there, right?
So then you hope they're not there, even though you're choosing a sample in which they're possibly there. Exactly.
In lack of any other strategy, right? Because if I think that it has nothing to do with any of these indicators, but with something completely different, then yeah.
But what if you go instead to the places where they are not there, so that you choose there is also another narrative?
But then I'm selecting into my independent variable, right? Like then I'm kind of delivering. Like then I'm gathering. Yeah.
What country is it? Lebanon?
It's Lebanon, yeah.
Yeah. I think in Lebanon, it would be strange to say average citizen without thinking about sectarian identities. But I mean, perhaps you want to argue against that. But I could imagine, are you planning to stay in Beirut particularly?
No, so basically, I mean, the argument also, or the argument that I want to make kind of is that, okay, I'm not really convinced anymore by this entirely like sectarian literature. Like I just think, like it's a bit of a rabbit hole, and I don't want to fall into the trap of you know, in the end producing a thesis that kind of says, I look at all these different sects, there's some things that unite them. Like I want to get a little bit out of the sectarian paradigm. That's number one. And number two, I think I wasn't going to stay in Beirut specifically. So basically the research design is based on following where activists go. So I identified like two, three kind of political activist groups and people that aim to compete in the 2022 elections. And I was thinking of kind of following them around, and then wherever they did, so wherever they are active, whenever they did certain activities, I would perhaps stay there and ask and talk to people about these activities and talk to people about the impact of this type of political activism that they kind of witnessed. And so it can basically take me wherever in Lebanon, right? That's the point. So yeah, it's not really, you know, it's not really geolocated, the research.
Why you want to frame it as average citizen? Maybe it's just, you know, like I think then Lilian surely knows better the context, but it sounds okay. But then from the people you'll be able to profile up, if it's not by this, like for whatever thing that will emerge, you will be able to profile up the people you talk with, so that you understand their answer to their questions in relation to some of their positionalities. They're still citizens, they're just not average citizens.
Also, Julian, surely if you're following these activist groups around or following their activities will be targeting something specific, most likely. You know, we know this, right? Things are always targeted at women or at people from this demographic or at people with disabilities, or, you know, whatever it is, or at youth empowerment, whatever. So that will already give you a hint as to where to go to, you know, were these activities, did they work for the people that they were directed towards, if you like?
I have to run, but I'm happy to chat about this more later. Sorry, I have another meeting at 4. But yeah, I think so far all of this advice I agree with, and it makes sense. And you might decide that you don't want to look at average citizen per se, but the citizens that are in these activist areas or something. But anyway, thanks for the great talk, guys.
I actually, if I might jump in that debate, now going back to your research, Greta, like about which then basically in your thesis, did you basically speak about the 3 families or did you speak about nomadic people in Kenya? So just like what level of abstraction did you use from the kind of sampling which you showed us when making just when writing up and talking?
Yeah. I use a lot the expression Turkana herders, which is a bit generalized perhaps, but because in the end I used a mix of so many different data collection, so it was like participant observation, living and doing the stuff with these families all the time, staying with them, but then a lot of focus groups, a lot of interviews, the key focus interviews, a bit of a service on livestock as well. Like I mixed up a lot of the sources of data collections. And in the thesis, I pick up from all of them. So like I put all of them together, including the field, including my diary. So there will be a field notes from the notes that you take during the day, then another notebook with interviews, household interviews or key informant interviews, and then a field diary for my participant observation with the families, and then another notebook with focus groups, and then the survey. All these things put all together, I think by date. So every day they would have all the things done that day. And then I went back and coded everything according to the themes that were emerging. So then in the thesis, it's not ethnographic in the sense that it's not on that family, but it tries to make a bit of broader claims because it's using many different sources, not just experience with the family. And I use this expression Turkana herders, but I think it's problematic. Like, I'm not totally happy with that.
Any other questions? Others? Marius, you had another one?
Yeah, I wanted to also ask about saturation. I think you've mentioned that, and how did you justify it, and how did you operationalize it? Yeah, in that research, like, when did you know it was enough? It was enough people, enough interviews.
I think, like, in practicality, is a mixture of the infrastructure that we confront doing research, so timelines, resources, like very structural thing that we face regardless of where you are in your research process. But also was the point I had ideas, or I had drafty ideas of answers to the questions, to the themes more than the questions. So I didn't really, but like the themes that were emerging, if one was the environment, at some point I knew what I would say about it. And that was increasing. The idea that I developed was finding increasing evidence from the conversations that were continuing to happening about it. So it was a bit instinctual as an approach, if you want, not necessarily, because I wasn't really able to do, all the things to say about participant observation, that you have to do the data collection, the writing up, but then also the analysis and a bit of the all together, so that you are really going through, which I think is important. If you are in a location which you can do that, it's great, but I wasn't, because I was in the middle of, dry lands. I didn't have a laptop, and I didn't have, so I couldn't really check up and do all these things that were supposed to be done. So, but I think you have a sense, and in my case was, okay, I think I know what I want to say here now, and then it was confirmed in the following time.
Jeff, yes, please.
Well, I mean, that's yeah, okay. That's, I don't know, that's a kind of it was instinctive, you said, right? I mean, you'll know it when you see it. That's I mean, is it possible to say more? Like, I mean, I thought where you were going, I thought when you said something like, well, you said it became more clear to you what you wanted to say about that, right? But was that a function of, in terms of thinking of like saturation that Marius asked about, that, you were talking to people again and asking certain kinds of questions and hearing back the same themes invoked or answers, and that allowed you to say, now I know what I want to say about this. So I mean, was it actually the criterion was that the people you were interacting with were reacting the same way, if I can put it that way, to your questions? I mean, that would be a bit more clear, at least for me, about when I stop, as opposed to sort of saying it's instinctual.
Yeah. That was more or less what I meant. I put it on a more instinctual level because I didn't have the actual equipment or sources in the field to check, like to do what I've done later with Vivo to check the coding, and at some point the coding, the percentage in my data sources was all the same, or the percentage was increasing. I didn't do that because I didn't have that equipment with me to be able to do that. But like as I especially from the second round, the first round of fieldwork was totally open. So it was, especially when I went back with the themes that were already emerging from the analysis of the previous data, that I started more or less went as you just described. So you would gather similar stories. Then the thing is that I didn't have in the second round of fieldwork structured interviews. It became more and more participant observation. So it's not that I was going around asking questions about what's the environment for you. So it was more, again, about the fact that I could observe the similar relationships with the environment progressively.
Yeah. Thank you.
An hour has passed. If you are okay, we can move to the activity and test the scenarios of the people who very gently shared it with us.